I think that if they really understood the product in which they were ordering and how we are analyzing and reporting our information, they would be more adapt to go, okay, well, that's really not as big of a difference between summary and a restricted report as they once thought.
Originating from deep inside the Rocky Mountains, transported through the power of the internet, and arriving inside your tiny earbuds. It's the Appraiser Coach Podcast, helping appraisers increase their efficiency, quality, and make more money. Here's the guy who makes it his life's mission to create value for real estate appraisers nationwide. Your host and the Appraiser Coach, Dustin Harris.
And welcome to the program, everybody. Dustin Harris hanging out once again in the podcast chair. Folks, I can't even believe this. I'm looking at the numbers on the screen right now. We are almost at, believe it or not, 1 million downloads for this lovely podcast that sits in the corner of your computer. So thank you, listeners. Thank you for being there, and I'm excited for today's show. I want to pause here to remind you that we're sponsored by 3 great companies, one of them being OREP Insurance. OREP, of course, is my E&O. It has been for several years now. I'm grateful for the E&O that I can trust, and E&O that gives all kinds of benefits, which I'm going to bring up here in just a little bit. But right now, you can go to orep.org. That's OREP.org. A la mode, of course, helping appraisers to be more effective, more efficient, to be able to do more. Check it out. Go to alamode.com or 800-ALAMODE. And speaking of doing more, DataMaster will help you to save time on every single report. It's DataMasterUSA.com. Again, it's DataMasterUSA.com. Well, I want to welcome back to the program a good friend of mine, Brian Kirkpatrick. He is an appraiser out of Dallas-Fort Worth. He's been on the show before. You might remember him as we talked about big data back in July of 2018. That is episode 343. And Brian, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me. Absolutely.
Since we last spoke, you've become an Accurity office. Tell the listeners briefly what that means.
I have. Accurity Valuation is basically a conglomerate that puts larger offices kind of looped together across the nation to share resources. And we've got a lot of cool, exciting new things that we're doing. And our motto is basically the valuation industry disruption. So we have a very progressive mindset. I'm extremely excited to be a member of that team specifically, and I encourage people to check it out and reach out to us.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. So last time we talked, I'll tell you, one of the reasons I like talking to you, Brian, is you are not a guy that just takes on the status quo and gets in line and does their job, clocks in and clocks out. You kind of like to think outside the box, right?
I've really tried to, and sometimes I wish that I didn't.
Life would be easier, right?
Right. Keep my mental state a little bit more on par. But I'm kind of one of the younger guys in the industry. I'm in my mid-30s. I've got a long time to work, and I feel that putting in the effort now, try to make some positive changes for the industry, especially for appraisers, and just have better communication. If there's one thing that we've, as a whole in the industry, I think is we've lacked significantly, is the communication, especially with clients and in the industry, and what we have to do, why we have to do it, and et cetera. So,
well, Brian's a member of my all-star team. He reaches out on a pretty regular basis with outside the box thinking a little bit. In fact, when he was on the program last time, I mentioned we talked about big data, but it wasn't just talking about big data. It was, if you'll remember, back in July of 2018, big data was kind of the big topic, and every appraiser was running around saying, "Oh my gosh, the sky's falling. They're collecting my data. They're doing this. They're doing that." And Brian's thought was, well, why don't we create our own big data? Right.
Which we haven't done yet. And,
no.
And I say that there's areas and there's people that have, but it's just one of those things that I don't have time for it. I don't know about anybody else, but the collaborative thinking on something like that would be great. And, I think since that year, I think we've all started looking at it a little bit differently, where instead of, the appraiser being the keeper and the creator of data, we're more the interpreter and the analyst. So I feel like my personal view on it has probably changed a little bit in the last couple of years, just because it's more or less now it's like, well, it's who cares who has the data? Let's worry about more how we interpret it and what we can do for our clients and for our industry that way. So
well, and I think that's really what sets appraisers apart, at least those that choose to be set apart. Is our clients are going to continue to come to us as long as we are the ones that are analyzing properly, and I think that's a key word, that data that's being distributed. It's not so much about being the keepers of the data anymore, as much as it is the expert, the professional that can take that data and make sense of it.
Absolutely, and I 100% back that statement.
Love it. Okay. So Brian reached out to me here a couple of weeks ago about another little issue. And that's what I want to talk about today, Brian, and I'll just warn the listeners up front. I don't know that we have quote unquote the solution to this problem. We're certainly going to throw out some ideas today as we banter back and forth, but we're just two appraisers talking about, an issue. And it's probably an issue that appraisers have run into. And if you haven't, you might. And this is the definitions that we give to appraisals, appraisal reports, what we do, what we deliver to our clients. Brian, explain what your question was to me, or your outside the box thinking on this issue.
Well, so one of the things I've noticed kind of an across the board with several of my clients, and mainly an AMC platform client, not so much a direct lender or obviously a private appraisal you're doing, but the difference in what we currently have under USPAP as the appraisal report versus the restricted appraisal report. And whatever happened to the summary appraisal report? Well, obviously we know that USPAP decided to drop that. And what did we decide that was 2008?
I don't know if we update. Tim is screaming at the
yeah, right. He's probably going to come on and bash me later and be like, oh, that kid does not know what he's talking about with his really cool radio voice. But honestly, if you read the definition of an appraisal report, the word summary is mentioned. But my thought on that is well, they've just graded this even more than it already really was, because how do you define summarize? That is a very open-ended question. And much like anything else in our industry, I feel like that's set up to not be in our favor. Because you can summarize it all you want, but it's up to somebody else to decide, did you summarize it enough or correctly? And really the biggest thing that I've noticed in a lot of different AMC work is when a revision request will come out, it's okay, well, please explain in more depth of X, Y, or Z adjustment or X, Y, or Z part of your analysis. And at least for my reporting and my work files, I have a ton of information from big data scrubbing that I have in a work file that helps get me to a reconciled portion of an analysis.
Right.
And in order to provide everything that USPAP says we should do under the definition of an appraisal report, sometimes that would really require me to give the client a ton of information in which they will not understand. Mm. And it's not really our job in an appraisal report to be, the appraisal or appraiser teacher 101. It's we're hired to do a job, we're reporting it, and we have to do it under the standards of USPAP. And so there's a big confliction of how much information does a client really want versus how much they need versus how are we actually doing it and are we doing it correctly? Because you can obviously, under the definition of an appraisal report nowadays, in my personal opinion, break USPAP very easily, because you may have a ton of information that you have in which you have reconciled your report to, and you probably have all that to back up, but how much of it do you actually put in the report or not put in a report to meet the USPAP definition of an appraisal report?
Right. So, Brian, when I was...
And I may have just spun myself completely in a circle with that statement.
No, that's exactly the problem. In fact, you and I were talking off the air before we started the recording about how confusing this can be. And I think that's one of the reasons I like you, Brian, is you don't just let these things float into your head and then pass out the other side. You let them kind of marinate and sit in there and you think through these things, because this really is an issue. And the issue, in my opinion, is what exactly are we putting out there as the product? When I was learning appraisal, when I was a trainee, I was taught there's basically 3 reports. There's a full narrative, right, which basically explains everything. It's called a narrative for a reason. It reads like a novel. You start with page 1 and you read through it, and by the time you get done, you fully understand the problem, you fully understand the analysis, you fully understand the solution, and you can be Joe Blow off the street, never read an appraisal before in your life, and still basically, as long as you have a 6th grade reading education, basically follow what has happened. On the other extreme, you have what we called restricted reports, which were basically a 1 or 2 page letter that on our letterhead basically said, hey, the appraisal is worth, or the home value property is worth X amount, and here's my certifications, and here's my signature. And that was it, other than the fact that, of course, you've got a huge work file to support that, which you don't deliver to the client. And then there's the in-between, the one that most appraisers probably spend 99% of their time on, and that's the old-fashioned 1004 or the 2055 or the 1025, these forms that we're all used to from Fannie and Freddie, where they used to be called summary reports, meaning we would give some information, we would keep some information in our work file, and now they get rid of that definition summary. And no pun intended here, Brian, but if I summarize the problem efficiently?
Yes, I believe so. And really, if you think about it, the 1004, or well, we can use that as the example, obviously, but the Fannie Mae form appraisal, or even the general purpose form that you can pull out of your a la mode bank,
right,
or whichever source you have, is technically a summary report. And actually, if you really want to dive into it, if you were to leave all the certifications, obviously, on those forms that are not amended, it's really set up to look like, feel like, and act like a restricted report,
right,
because we're checking boxes. And the longest section they have in that pre-populated form to write any narrative is about 15 or 20 lines. And if you're doing a summary or a more self-contained, which I don't believe is even a definition anymore, because now it's just appraisal report,
right,
you're going to need more space. And so really what I think, and again, my opinion of the matter is USPAP got rid of the definition of a summary report, but the form in which most residential appraisers are using did not change.
Yeah.
So now we have a change in USPAP definition, but no significant change in how we're reporting. And so it can be confused, I think, extremely easily. And you couple that with the idea that most of our clients are not as well trained in understanding the actual appraisal process in USPAP, we're really going to hit a rather large area of miscommunication, especially when it comes to, well, how much do you give a client? How much do you don't give a client? Before they literally don't understand what it is you're talking about because you've loaded them up with so much information.
Or too little.
Correct. So again, the definition of summarize, what is that?
Right. And add to that the issue that in the 2021 USPAP, they also changed the way in which a client can be a client in a restricted report. And my understanding in the past, and certainly this is more of a question for Tim than it is for me, but my understanding, just a schmuck with a microphone, is that the reason these individuals put that definition in there, that we had to be very careful about our clients and how many clients we could put in there, was because a restricted report had to be able to be understood by the reader, meaning the less the reader was informed, the more we had to put in that report. And now they've taken that away. So that adds to me even one more level of complexity, because first of all, do we even understand who's reading this? Is it an underwriter? Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? Is it the agent? Is it the loan officer? Is it Joe Schmo that found it on the side of the curb when he was walking down the street? Are we obligated to make sure that individual understands these things? And so now you add to that this level of complexity, which, let's face it, you said it, Brian, and I'm just going to reiterate it. We're still providing a summary report, despite the fact that that definition isn't there anymore. Nobody's turning in narrative reports. No one's turning in a fully contained appraisal report. And so
we're also not turning in a restricted report either.
Exactly. So how little, how much do we put in that report, and does it depend on the reader?
Right.
Yeah.
And technically, if you want to really just kind of narrow this down to the majority of the work that we as the residential appraisers are doing, is mortgage work. So the identified client is the lender. So actually, under USPAP, we're not really obligated to have to explain in whatever sense we need to any other identified user. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. It just means that that's our real only obligation. And forgive me, I am next to an Air Force base, so if you hear planes in the background,
I hear that. Yeah, that'll make
and they only take off when I get on the phone or do something like this.
I love it. Let's let them pass over.
Right. The question is how many of them are going to take off.
Yeah.
So really the way I've looked at this in the past probably year or so is a lender really wants to see a more or less, if they had to pick and choose, I think most of them would want to see a restricted report. It's less information that they have to underwrite through. It's less that the reviewers have to see, maybe beyond the just stated information. Obviously, a 2-page restricted report would not suffice for a GSE-backed lending appraisal these days. But I think that again, my opinion is, if we're going to have only 2 definitions of an appraisal, I think a form appraisal in these kind of transactions really needs to lean more towards a restricted appraisal report. And that's based more on the fact of the amount of information that we typically are going to have in our work file nowadays, because most appraisers, not every appraiser, but most appraisers are using some sort of technology to assist them in their analyzation, their reporting, which, if you look at your work file from some of our great tools that we can use, you don't have near that much information going in the report. Not to say you can't summarize it, but if we're literally not going to have that definition of an appraisal reporting type, again, my opinion is that we should be able to call it a restricted report. Not necessarily stop giving the information, but literally, I think to be USPAP compliant, being able to refer to a 1004 federally related transaction or GSE appraisal report as restricted instead of an actual report would more define what we're actually turning in.
We're talking with Brian Kirkpatrick out of Dallas, a great appraiser and great thinker. When we get back, Brian, I want to kind of dive in a little bit more to what this means for appraisers and what we can do about it. So I want to pause here and remind you we are sponsored by 3 great companies, one of them being OREP Insurance. Folks, I want to read to you a true to life testimonial from an individual I know very closely, Rob, who is a member of my dream team. And over the weekend, he posted this on our All-Star Team Facebook page. He said, just finished up my renewal CE using classes that were quote unquote included in my OREP E&O plan. First year with OREP after a long time with another company. The rate was 40% less and the responsiveness from OREP in the process was great. The CE was a nice bonus, 14 hours included, and all the classes were very reasonable. Thank you, Rob, for that great testimonial. Folks, if you're with any other company, I would check out OREP Insurance. It's spelled OREP, and you can find them at orep.org. A la mode, of course, helping appraisers to be more effective at what they do. In fact, really what Brian and I are talking about today, a la mode is there to help you to be able to make sense of the data that you're analyzing and being able to report properly. They have all the forms that you need, all of the tools at your fingertips. Folks, if you've not recently taken time to check out Alamode, I encourage you to do so. It's spelled ALAMODE, and you can find them at alamode.com or 800-ALAMODE. Finally, we're sponsored by DataMaster. DataMaster, of course, taking great big groups of data, summarizing it, putting it in your report, helping to save you time, helping to save you energy, helping to analyze that data as well with DataMaster 6. Folks, if you are in an area that DataMaster serves, and they are serving MLS systems across the country, go to datamasterusa.com and find out if they are in your area and check out their free trial. datamasterusa.com, again, datamasterusa.com. All right, folks, welcome back to the program. We're talking with Brian Kirkpatrick about the problem on the table. You know, what do we call our reports? So we keep getting changes in definitions and definitions kind of deleted from USPAP, Brian. And here we are essentially doing summary reports still, which essentially, because there's no summary reports, is a restricted report. Yet, have you ever tried to put restricted report on a 1004 and turn it in?
I have, and that's a big no-no. Yeah. And it was more or less one of those things like, well, I'm going to try this one and see if anybody ever actually catches it. And sure enough, they did, and you know, it kind of makes it. Well, and it was like, hey, we can't take that. And, you know, back in my head, I'm like, well, actually you can, but whatever. And this is what it is. But there's some days where you just go, you know, I really would like to fight this battle. But at the end of the day, it's like, well, I've got 3 more reports to do today, right? Right. You have to get, you have a workflow that you have to attend to, right. And at the end of the day, you have to make a living. But that's why I like platforms like this, because we can go on and discuss this, and maybe somebody will listen to it at some point and go, you know what, maybe those 2 clowns were right. Because again, I'm just a schmuck with a microphone over here too. So the idea behind, I think, honestly, having a platform to educate. So who can we go to? Obviously, we could have USPAP amended, and that's probably the easiest way I think we could get things done. But the education towards your big box clients is another way. I think that if they really understood the product in which they were ordering and how we are analyzing and reporting our information, they would be more adapt to go, okay, well that's really not as big of a difference between summary and restricted report as they once thought. And again, too, so the definitions kind of have to change with the times. USPAP changes with the times. The amount of analytical software that most appraisers are using these days is way more advanced than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, obviously 20 years ago. You know, we're still working on a form that was last really amended in 2005, which, if the birdies have told me correctly, that's going to change pretty soon. But in order to use a form that's dated as much as it is and have to be able to be USPAP compliant, my thought and idea really is that we should be doing a summary appraisal report like we've been talking about, how we've done, but being able and being allowed to refer to it to be USPAP compliant as restricted. And now people are mowing outside. So it's just one of those days. There's weed eater hitting the glass.
It's all good. I think we're pretty close to being wrapped up anyway, because honestly, Brian, I mean, there's definitely things that we can do. I think one of them is what we're doing right now is education, is getting the bug in people's ears and starting to allow them to think, because I don't know how many people, I'll be honest with you, Brian, when you reached out to me at first, I had to read your message twice. I'm like, what exactly is he saying? And then once it started hitting, I thought, I never really thought about that. And I don't think most listeners have. And I think that's the important thing, is that we start to realize, let's face it, if we are standing before the state board and they say, where's this, and this, and then they ask, well, why didn't you put this, and this in there? And you gave me an example off the air, because I said, Brian, you actually had an AMC say you got too much information in the report? And tell me the story there, because you have.
Sure. And I would venture out to say that lots of your listeners have probably had a similar revision request, where it's like, well, either a revision or an off the record conversation with a reviewer potentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, you've got a lot of boilerplate and blah, blah, blah. Well, and really what's boiled down to is the losing the definition of the summary appraisal report, coupled, I think, with all the changes in regulations and X, Y, and Z. We have to CYA so much more information. And sure, is it boilerplate? Yes, but technically, if we don't have it in there, are we being USPAP compliant by not including it?
Right.
Because we can't summarize, we have to technically report.
It's a conundrum for sure.
So, and I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm simply kind of bringing up the question of, are we doing it correctly? And if somebody who's way smarter than me would like to really clarify that, speak up, because I really think that this is one of those issues that somebody could, if they have not already gone, and been audited by a state board, and the state board goes, hey, where's X, Y, and Z? And somebody's response could potentially be, well, my client thought that was too much information and they didn't want it in there.
Right. That'll go over like a lead balloon.
Exactly. So that's why I was like, this may be a great topic to throw out there and have the discussion about. I don't have necessarily a solution. I have suggestions, but I think that's a great starting point.
Brian, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time.
And congratulations on almost 1 million downloads. That's awesome.
Yeah, we're getting there. Well, and thank you to you. It's individuals like you willing to put themselves out there and be on the podcast. And by the way, this is a compliment to you and an open invitation to others. It's not tough, right?
No, not at all. No. Especially if you're like me and you just like to talk.
I love it, man. I love it. All right, my friend, thank you for being on once again. That is Brian Kirkpatrick out of Dallas, and Fort Worth, Texas.
There you go.
Right. There's a huge difference, I hear.
There is.
All right, my friend, we will catch you later.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Appraiser Coach podcast with Dustin Harris. If you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and post a short review on iTunes. For more in-depth insider information on how you can make more money as a real estate appraiser, visit theappraisercoach.com and sign up for the All-Star team today. Thanks for joining us. And now, get out there and create some value.
The rate was 40% less, and the responsiveness from OREP in the process was great. The CES was also, sorry, editor, let me back up, start here.